Oh, welcome to another episode of The Growth Compass. Shout out to our sponsor, Senders. If you want to do cold email deliverability correctly, you know how to get in touch with me. Today, we have an awesome guest. I have a trillion questions for you, Robert Lee from Rescuing Leftover Cuisine. What's up, Robert?
Not much. Thanks for having me. It's
Man,
good to be here.
absolutely. Absolutely. Where are you calling from today?
I'm calling from New York City.
Hey, look at that. We're close. I'm in Philly.
Yeah, very
That's
close
awesome.
by.
Cool. Super cool what you're getting into. I think for everyone tuning in today, as everyone knows, this podcast focuses on growth strategies, how people take ideas and bring them into the world. And you're doing something that's very interesting and very challenging and have been pretty successful bringing it into the world. So if you could just give a brief introduction of yourself and also what you're working on today.
Sure, absolutely. I like to start off honestly with my own personal story just because it kind of gives a little
Do
bit of
it.
context and provides kind of more of a background of kind of why I made the decisions I've made.
Awesome.
But honestly, my parents came here looking for a better life, typical immigrant story, and unfortunately they struggled. And they couldn't find equivalent jobs here and from what they had in Korea. And I grew up just thinking food insecurity was a normal circumstance. I just thought that hunger was just a normal thing that everyone was going through. And I would honestly rescue food that would just kind of come across, my table. So I would, often watch my parents skip meals. We would sometimes have just one bowl of, ramen, and that would be it for the whole day. And so, yeah, it just kind of became second nature to me to take home bags of carrots, apples that kids didn't like, and stuff like that. And I would just take it home and eat it. Um, so, growing up like that, I think, primarily focused on education as a way to kind of get out of that cycle. Luckily, was fortunate enough to go to a school where they continued to help kind of progress that forward. Ended up working in finance
Uh,
at JP Morgan, trying to make as much money as possible. And then I came across this club that brought leftover dining hall food to homeless shelters at NYU, and I just had to get involved. And I just, you know, got so involved to the point where we wanted to kind of take the concept and bring it outside the borders of NYU and entered into a venture competition, won some seed money, and that was really the start of it all.
and how long ago was that?
That was 2013. Well, I was involved in the club from 2009, 2013, but yeah,
Wow.
it's been a while.
Yeah, so it's been a consistent journey then with and it's a nonprofit, correct?
Yeah, 501c3.
So it's been a consistent journey with that nonprofit for approximately, what is that, 13 years now?
Yeah. 12 years officially as a 501c3 nonprofit, and then 16 years of doing food rescue in general.
Well, congrats. Yeah, I think that's awesome. So something that's really interesting. I don't know if I think listeners would be familiar with my conversation with Kate Williams of 1% to the Planet. We talked a lot about the differences in approaches for growth between nonprofits and for-profit entities. So, and then the second part of it is when you've had a journey that's as long as yours, it's interesting to talk about the different growth strategies that you've gone through at the beginning and where you're at now. So, I think the first thing I'd like to get into is when you were first starting, if you could talk about how you defined what success was as far as growth, and how you defined what your goals were, and how did you go about growing in the very
It's an
beginning.
excellent question. I think a lot of people, especially in the nonprofit space, are not as quantitatively focused on goals. And I think that was one of the things that we wanted to be very hyper focused on from the very beginning. And so when we started in 2013, we set goals. The first year was honestly no one was full time, everyone was volunteer. And we set our goals as the metric that we decided to kind of have as our measure of success was number of pounds of food. And that was mostly driven by kind of the industry, food rescue as a whole, big players like City Harvest, food banks, they had always measured their impact as number of pounds of food. And so we decided to do something similar. It's quantifiable, it's easy to measure, and it can easily be translated into carbon emissions or meals for people facing food security. Now, we set certain metrics like 10,000 pounds of food rescued per year, or like, 30,000, and eventually, kind of grew from there and into the millions. But yeah, in terms of that second portion of that question, I think that growth metric and the measure of success has definitely evolved and grown from there. And it's definitely an interesting kind of, thought of like, what do you define as success and how do you measure that? Especially in the nonprofit space, I think it's a little bit less, cut and dry in terms of, dollars,
Definitely.
profit.
Yeah, so I am curious how that's evolved. And I guess at the beginning, when you were defining success as pounds of food rescued, how did that drive the decisions that you were making? I guess if you could, what would you define as your customer or your primary partner that you were looking to acquire? Was it more of a marketplace because you're in the middle of the suppliers and then the demand for the people that would need it? How do you
Yeah, it's a
understand
great
that?
question. Yeah, I think when we take a step back and think about the model of rescuing leftover cuisine, what we essentially wanted to do was the ultimate mission and goal was to solve the two problems of wasted food and food insecurity, right? And really make food rescue the universal standard, right? It's a common sense solution. We wanted to make it commonplace. That was the basis of where we started. With that kind of basis, we wanted to measure our impact in terms of number of pounds of food because we saw that the more pounds of food we rescued, that means we were, taking a chunk out of that food being wasted and we're feeding people with it. The way that's evolved over time, I think, is really interesting because there's different metrics that kind of play into the success metrics of kind of making food rescue more of a universal standard. And I think that it heavily impacts the decisions that we make because when we first started off with the metric of just the pounds of food, every decision you make goes to will this increase the number of pounds of food that you rescue, right? And I think that in a lot of cases, when we kind of work with food donor partners, the way it works is we partner with a restaurant, food business, catering company, even cafeterias within office buildings. We rescue that food at the end of the night and we bring it over to homeless shelters, soup kitchens, food pantries.
Okay.
The reason we got started was really because, great organizations like City Harvest and Food Bank were doing really great work with fleets of trucks. And to optimize that model, they had a minimum pound requirement. So they won't go buy for smaller amounts of food. And so
Interesting.
we targeted a niche market where essentially it was a B2B service where we essentially helped restaurants that wanted to donate their food, but they couldn't because they couldn't meet the requirements, the minimum pound requirements. And so we used a Ruby on Rails web application to kind of engage people to bring their own cars, bring their own vehicles, bikes, sometimes even just walking power to rescue that food and bring it to people who need it. And so what that did for us was we realized, hey, by measuring our impact by a number of pounds, it actually like puts us down the same exact path as City Harvest and Food Bank because they're optimizing number of pounds of food. So you're naturally going to want to work with partners that have lots and lots of pounds of food. And naturally also you also kind of become less interested in preventing wasted food because ultimately that would hurt your figures, right? So if you start working with the food business that starts to realize, hey, they have a lot more waste than they thought,
Huh.
and they start to like reduce and get more efficient and like, you know, cut down their waste, ultimately we would love that. I think that's like perfect. Statistically, of the 40% of food that's going to waste, which is obviously a massive number, the amount of nutrition and food that you need to eliminate food insecurity is just one third of that. So we're producing way more than we need to feed everyone in this nation. And honestly, prevention is key. So we want to incentivize people to see the data that we provide them of how much food they're actually donating and to see that number come down and then plateau over time. But, it's just fascinating how that kind of, you know, grows and evolves over time.
Yeah, well, that I mean that yeah, that's a great segue into what we were discussing because mostly what we had talked about is how you did it in the beginning and how it drove your decision making. So, how has that changed over time, and how are you defining it now? Because you're speaking about a change between optimizing how much food gets rescued and now incentivizing people to minimize the amount of food that they waste in the
Yeah.
first place. So, is that how you define success now? If it's not, how do you define success now, and how is it driving your decisions as far as partnerships and growth of the nonprofit.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, at the end of the day, the success metrics that you set are going to be the benchmark and the thing that you kind of go back to for every decision that you kind of make, and you're like, is this going to move the needle for this metric, right? And so over the years, what we've kind of come to as a kind of next iteration of this metric of success, we essentially have created kind of a scorecard. And I think it's one of the, I think, appealing parts of the for-profit space in general is like everyone's aligned, right? Like we have to maximize profits, right, for the shareholders, and so unfortunately in the nonprofit space it's not as clear cut and dry, and you can't just maximize the bottom line.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, we, on our side have kind of essentially a metric, a scorecard of three metrics that essentially we're balancing. And essentially every decision comes back to those three kind of metrics. Will it impact the number of pounds of food? Will it impact the number of food donor partners we're working with? Because the more food donor partners we're working with, the more this movement is growing and becoming a habit and latching on to more people and eventually getting to the point where there's a tipping point and hopefully, it becomes a trend across the board for all food donor, all food businesses. And then finally, the number of rescues. So will it be something that increases the activity of the organization so that it's more opportunities for people to be involved, volunteer, see the problems firsthand, etc. And so even if the pounds of food decrease per pickup, which we've seen, as long as the number of rescues continues to be increasing and the number of food donor partners seems to be increasing, then we know we're continuing to make impact and headway into a world in which all food businesses donate their excess food, not just throw it away.
That's super interesting. So, when you say increase the number of rescues, are you referring to people who are individually contributing and volunteering, or are you talking about an instance where a pickup is occurring?
A pickup occurring.
And so if you have two pickups in a week to gather 500 pounds of food each, that is more successful than one time 1,000 pounds of food.
Well, if we had just chosen the number of rescues, that would be the case.
Okay.
But no, I mean that logically, I think that's less efficient.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so it's kind of a balance between the three because we don't want to optimize so much to the point where we're just like one rescue per year and we're doing like
Sure.
2 million. It's a balance. I think it's a balancing act between the three, which always makes it harder because then it's like your decisions are weighed against three different metrics and it's
Yeah.
not as clear what decisions are towards what goals and metrics, but we kind of have it in a balance there.
Yeah. So, okay, I have some good questions for you. I'm gonna try and squeeze them in the
Yeah,
time that we
yeah,
have remaining. So,
absolutely.
yeah. So related to this question, your guys' growth within those three metrics are contingent on the number of food business partners that you are picking up from and the number of people you have volunteering. Is there a third layer where you're considering how the food is utilized once?
Yeah.
So do you, as far as your growth goes, do you have goals for increasing the amount of relationships in all three departments, or how do you understand
Yeah,
that?
we kind of see it as cascading metrics, right? So from the three, everything kind of cascades below under that. And in terms of the metrics for utilization and ensuring that our nonprofit recipients are actually using the food, needing the food, that's actually one of the things that I think it became pretty clear early on that our nonprofit recipients could easily use the food and need more of it, especially in environments like what we're facing today with inflation and uncertainty, tariffs, etc., migrant crisis, and stuff like that. There just seems to be a lot of demand, and so we do quarterly kind of check-ins with our nonprofit recipients, ensure that we're having them receive the right types of food because some places actually don't serve 7 days a week. Sometimes they're only once a week. Sometimes they only do dinner. Sometimes they only do lunch. That kind of things. And so we want to match the food that we have with what they need. But yeah, all of those metrics kind of trickle down from the number of pounds, partners, and rescues.
Okay, so then if okay, so that's cool. So it sounds like out of those three things is important to continue growing them, but what's the main priority is the amount of food businesses and the amount of people volunteering. So I guess speaking about both of those, what is your primary strategy, or if there's several, what are your strategies for increasing the amount of relationships with food businesses?
Yeah, that's the number one bottleneck right now, and I think it's interesting because when we first started, honestly, people just thought it was illegal, right? Like I remember when I was leaving my job, yeah, it's laughable, honestly.
That is
But
wild.
it was the case, yeah. When I quit my job at JP Morgan, my boss was like, you know, you're quitting your job to do something illegal, right?
Wow.
And honestly, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act of 1996 has been around for a while. And the fact that like even back in 2013, people thought it was illegal and that like there was myths going around like, oh, McDonald's got sued for donating their food, blah blah blah. I don't want to donate my food. That it was incredible to me. But I think, over the past, 12 years, things have changed. People know now that you can donate your food. It's completely legal. Not only is it legal, completely legal, you can actually get enhanced tax deductions. You can get incentives for doing this, right? You can reduce your food disposal costs. You get so many benefits from doing this service. And now I forget what your question was because I get
Yeah, yeah. It was what's your primary strategy for reaching
right,
more
right, right,
food
right, right.
businesses? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So in
I
the
guess
beginning, it was
that's a hurdle that you've gotten over in the past, or is it still something you run into?
no, no. Now we don't have to like. In the beginning, we used to go like door to door, and we used to bring printouts of the Bill and Good Samaritan Act and the
Awesome.
state version of that same act, just to show people like, hey, this is we're not making this up. This is totally
Yeah,
legal.
yeah.
Honestly, though, even if it was illegal, I would do it. I would still like
Sure.
fight
Yeah,
and
yeah.
push. Like, I mean, there's so many things where people like fight for things that are illegal that are totally should not be illegal, right?
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
this is one of those things that I think we shouldn't be fighting for. We should
Yeah.
be angry about. We should be pushing for. But
Well, what is it
anyways,
that you do now? Yeah, for reaching
yeah.
those
Now
suppliers.
our partnerships department, they reach out. We do cold emails. We do a lot of typical kind of sales and partnerships activities. A lot of LinkedIn. A lot of like referrals. That's been really huge. But truly, yeah, it's all kinds of different food businesses now. And ever since the pandemic, we've expanded to various types of food businesses. And so, definitely, if folks, listening know anyone that's in the food space, restaurants, catering companies, but also like hospitality. We also have stadiums now that have been joining us and rescuing their excess food
Congrats.
with us. Yeah, it's been incredible to see, and you know, we recently heard, I think last year we heard a statistic that only like 17% of stadiums donate their excess food, and like that should be 100%, right? Like I think we're at the stage where this should be pretty common standard practice. But yeah, we do a lot of the typical kind of sales activities to get them on board.
Cool. And then what about your volunteer pool? Are there
Yeah,
specific strategies around that?
absolutely. And I think, this kind of touches on an earlier point where you can kind of see RLC as a marketplace, but it's not a true marketplace in that people are not really buying anything on the other two sides of the market, right? So between the, food businesses, the rescuers who are actually doing the rescues, and the nonprofit recipients, the nonprofit recipients are receiving the services for free from us, as in they're getting the food, and our rescuers are, rescuing food, but the food businesses are actually paying for the service. But in general, the rescuer side of things, when we first started, it was fully, purely 100% volunteer. While that was a great model to start with, and it was what we learned in college. Like we can get, these college students to help out and be a movement to,
Yeah.
make this more efficient. It doesn't scale super well.
Okay.
Everyone has the same. I mean, it was the same problems in college. Everyone has the same midterms. Everyone has the same finals. Everyone has the same problems. Everyone has spring break. Everyone has the same like Friday night parties and all that. So what we saw was we weren't able to provide the professional level of service to make this a habit, to make this work professionally for a food business. And so what we essentially did was we created a level of rescuer that were paid, and so they're 1099s, and essentially they're able to get paid for the work that they do. And essentially, it brings that level of professionalism, ensures that we have a 99% success rate.
Wow.
We're always there and make sure that people can actually rely on this food rescue service.
When did you make that pivot?
Pretty early on, I'd say like 2015,
Oh, yeah.
2016. Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, yeah.
Cool. Well, we're getting down to we're packing a lot in this episode. I want to go into all of these spaces, but I just want to make sure, like at least in the initial one, we cover some ground. So something that I alluded to at the beginning that is of extreme interest to me is the way that running or growing a nonprofit is perceived. And I want to get your thoughts about how you go about fundraising and then using funds that you receive in grants, or I guess you do have some revenue from your model also, how you distribute that money and allocate it towards growth efforts, because to a lot of people it's taboo to spend that money on marketing or sales, if you want to label it that. But in some other opinions, not doing it puts you behind in ultimately the amount of impact that you can make. So I'm curious where you fall in that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a pretty, you know, uh, kind of black and white, perspective on it. I think,
Good.
coming from, the finance space and from, working at JP Morgan, being trained at, Stern, I just think that, nonprofits are just like any other company and organization,
Good.
right? We have expenses, we have revenue, we have full-time employees, we have to pay payroll taxes.
Yep.
Like we have like basically everything that a for-profit has, except there's no equity. So you can't, raise a Series A or Series B. There's no like hope for a sellout or a buyout, right? There's a different mechanism of funding and starting, but I do think that the realities of everyday kind of operation is exactly the same. And I think that nonprofits in general that rely on purely fundraising is reliant on kind of any type of business model that kind of works for, let's say, like events or like, I know a lot of nonprofit organizations that are just event management companies, right? They just put on events and they, produce really great events, really great feel good events that, end up raising money for a great cause. But truly, that's their business model, right? And so I do think that in general, nonprofits do need to kind of figure out what is their business model. How do you like define that, and then how do you grow that? Just like any other company, because I mean, I'm one of the people who believe that like if you're not growing, you're dying.
Okay. Nice. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that perspective because I think, I do believe so far and gathering more opinions every day about it, but I do think that ultimately maximizes that mindset, that approach ultimately maximizes the impact available to you. So that's really cool. Have you ran into any issues with that type of mindset in your 12 years of operation, raising funds, things like that?
Ton, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
we run into issues all the time, right? And I think even with us charging for the food rescue service, like it's not like a huge deal. Like colleges charge tuition, museum charges admissions, they're all nonprofits, right? There's nonprofit property management companies. There's nonprofit banks, right? Like I think people are just like not super aware, and they have like this thought and this preconception of what a nonprofit should be. And so we've had people just tell us like, hey, I've had like a food donor partner go like, hey, tell Robert specifically that he's ruining his organization, right? Like we've had people do that. We've had like, there's always people who are going to like, I think, you know, rain on your parade. And I think that as with any company, I think there comes a point where you kind of like choose your customers as well. And I think that it's the same thing for nonprofits. You kind of choose your donor base. You choose who you work with. So yeah.
Cool. Well, I have two final questions for you, and I'm resisting like all of the other directions that we could go, but I do love hearing these answers from um, all the guests because it just gets to just continually give. And so the first one is, what is the biggest challenge that you're facing right now, and can you frame it as an opportunity?
Yeah, I think number one is really we're, as I said, we're facing a lot of like, good momentum while also like seeing a lot of external negative headwinds. And I think that our biggest bottleneck is trying to find more food donor partners. It's an exciting time to be in the food rescue space. As I mentioned, there's more awareness. There's more folks who want to be involved in this. But I think that we need to keep pushing to bring on more food donor partners and show them the bottom line impacts of what they can benefit from taking part in this. And so I'd say that it's a challenge to continually try to find the next food donor partner, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to really show them that they can make money and save costs from doing this. Overall, I think that that's how you make that true change in systems level, kind of advancement. But we'll see.
Cool. Well, related to that, because I appreciate that's a cool answer. Related to that, and it can be something small that happened recently, or it can be something that is larger over time, things like that. But what inspires you?
Man, I think a lot of things really inspire me. I think truly like the at the end of the day, like I was personally affected by this, and hearing the stories of people having, like, for example, we heard a story of someone who came to US, the very first meal they had was from RLC, right? And I think that like those moments truly still make me keep on trying to fundraise, keep trying to push this forward, grow more. And I think that bottom line is we produce enough food in this country to feed everyone, and we just need to get the distribution right. So that's what we're trying to do.
Jake, let's do it. Let's go. Come on, Robert. We're all rooting for you, man. Well, that's awesome. Well, this has been super cool. Thank you so much for answering my answer
Yeah, of
my
course. Yeah,
question.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, I hope next time we can do this in person.
Sounds
Uh,
amazing. Yeah.
if anybody wants to find you, what's the best way to reach out?
Best way is our website, rescuingleftovercuisine.org.
You got it. You heard that? It's their website. Can you say it again?
Rescuingleftovercuisine.org.
Boom. Everybody, make sure you hit that up. It's awesome what you're doing, Robert. Thank you for taking the
Thank
time
you so
today.
much.
Super
I
cool.
appreciate it.
You got it. Have a good day.